My name is Aurora Blake. I was 25 when everything changed. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're intruding on something sacred. I sat in the third chair from the door, the one closest to the window, because I always liked to know where the light was coming from. My cousin Marlene sat beside me in a black dress that fit her too well for someone who claimed she hadn't slept in days. We were there for my father's will. I should say my parents' will, though by then it was only my father's signature that mattered. My mother had passed 2 years earlier, quietly, in the hospital bed by the window she'd asked for, so she could watch the maple tree lose its leaves one last time. My father followed her the way some people do, not from illness, but from the slow unraveling of a man who no longer had a reason to hold himself together. Mr. Feld, the family attorney, cleared his throat and opened a folder that looked thinner than I expected a lifetime should be. The house, he said, the investment accounts, the lake property. All to Marlene and Whitfield. I didn't move. I don't think I even blinked. Somewhere behind my ribs something folded in on itself, quietly, like a letter being put back in its envelope. And to Aurora Blake, he continued, a sealed envelope, to be opened only in private. Marlene didn't look at me. She never did, not really, not since we were children, and she learned that averting her eyes made accusations bounce off her like rain off glass. Her mother, my Aunt Diane, reached over and squeezed her hand, already halfway to a smile she was trying to suppress out of decency. I took the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be, and my name was written on in my father's handwriting, the same hand that used to write my lunch notes, the same hand that once wrote "I'm proud of you" on the back of a report card I'd been too afraid to show him. Outside, the November air was sharp enough to make my eyes water, or maybe that was something else. I stood on the courthouse steps holding an envelope that might have contained anything, an apology, an explanation, or nothing at all, while 30 years of family history rearranged itself behind my eyes. I didn't open it there. Some things you have to be alone for. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the envelope on the passenger's seat like a stranger I'd just picked up and didn't yet know whether to trust. I grew up in the yellow house on Larkspur Lane, the one with the crooked mailbox my father never fixed because he said it had character. Marlene grew up 2 streets over, but she was at our table more nights than her own, especially after her father left, and my mother decided that feeding another child was cheaper than watching my aunt cry. I don't resent that. Children don't choose the shape of their kindness. It's given to them, and they carry it forward or they don't. What I remember is smaller things. The way my mother would set 2 plates for dessert, and somehow Marlene's always had the bigger slice. The way "we're so proud of Marlene" became a sentence spoken so often it lost its edges, like a stone smoothed by a river. The way my school certificates were placed in a drawer while Marlene's were framed on the hallway wall, dust-free, catching the afternoon light just so. I used to think I was imagining it. That's the particular cruelty of quiet favoritism. It never gives you anything solid enough to hold up and say, "Here, look, this is unfair." It just accumulates, sediment by sediment, until one day you realize you've been standing at the bottom of something you didn't know was being built. My father wasn't a cruel man. I want to be clear about that because this isn't a story about cruelty. He worked long hours at the hardware store he inherited from his own father, came home smelling of sawdust and coffee, and hugged me at the door every single evening without fail. He taught me to change a tire before I could parallel park. He cried at my college graduation, the real kind of crying, the kind men of his generation weren't supposed to know how to do. But somewhere along the way, guilt had made a home in him. Guilt about Marlene's father leaving. Guilt about my Aunt Diane's hard years. And guilt, I would come to understand, has a way of writing itself into the ledger of a family in the currency of things, houses, money, deeds, as if property could apologize for what words never did. I sat in my apartment that night with the envelope unopened on the kitchen table, and I thought about all of this. Not with rage. With a strange, hollow tiredness, the kind that comes not from one wound but from 1,000 small ones you taught yourself not to feel. I opened it on a Sunday morning, with tea going cold beside me and rain moving sideways past the window. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting, and beneath it a smaller envelope marked for the attorney's eyes. when Aurora is ready." The letter began without ceremony. "Aurora, if you're reading this, then I've run out of time to say what I should have said while I still had a voice to say it with." He wrote about my mother, about how her diagnosis had frightened Diane into believing she and Marlene would be left with nothing, and how, in a year when grief made all of us reckless, he had restructured the will to protect them, meaning to fix it later, meaning to explain it to me in person, meaning, as people so often mean, to do the right thing eventually. "Eventually became too long," he wrote. That is my failure, not yours. Forgive the years I let silence do the parenting silence was never suited for. He explained that the sealed envelope for the attorney contained something else, a separate account he had built privately, one Diane and Marlene didn't know existed, funded slowly over 15 years from money he'd never told anyone about. Not because he wanted secrecy for its own sake, he wrote, but because he wanted one thing in this family that couldn't be argued over, softened by guilt, or rearranged by anyone else's grief. "It was never that I loved you less," the letter ended. It was that I trusted you more, to survive without me proving it in deeds and drawers.
I was wrong to test you that way.
I'm sorry it took me a lifetime and a funeral to say so. I sat with that letter for a long time. I did not cry immediately. The tears came later, in the shower, where I let them do what they needed to do without an audience, even an audience of one. What I felt first was something quieter than grief and stranger than relief, the sensation of finally being believed by someone who was no longer there to see my face when I read it. I called Mr. Feld the following week. His office was smaller this time, or maybe I simply took up less space in it, having already survived the worst of what a room like that could hold. He slid the second envelope across the desk, along with a folder of statements going back over a decade. "Your father set this up through a private trust," he explained, "structured so it wouldn't touch the primary estate. He was very specific that this remains separate from any family discussion." The number surprised me, not because it was extravagant, but because it represented such patient, invisible discipline. Small deposits. Consistent. Unremarkable on their own. Staggering in accumulation. A man quietly correcting an imbalance he never spoke aloud, for 15 years, while the rest of us built our assumptions on what we could see instead of what we couldn't. "There's a condition," Mr. Feld added, almost gently. "He asked that you decide in your own time whether to disclose this to your aunt and cousin. He didn't want to make that choice for you. He said you'd know when or if the moment was right." I left the office with a folder pressed against my chest like something that might otherwise blow away. I didn't tell Marlene.
Not yet.
Some truths need to be turned over slowly, examined from every angle, before you can hand them to someone else, without them turning to weapons in the transfer. Instead, I drove to the lake property, Marlene's now, though she'd never once mentioned wanting to keep it, and sat on the dock where my father used to take me fishing before dawn, back when the world was small enough to fit inside a rowboat and a thermos of coffee. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story that feels good to imagine, the version where the truth arrives like a trumpet blast and the wrong daughter finally wins, isn't the version that actually happened inside me. What I felt was older than triumph. Something closer to being seen. I told my Aunt Diane 3 weeks later, over coffee at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten 1,000 childhood dinners. She didn't say much at first. She turned her mug in slow half circles, the way people do when they're buying time to feel something before they have to speak it. "I always worried," she finally said, "that we took more than our share. Not the house, I mean of him, of your father's attention. I told myself it was because we needed it more. I never once asked if that was fair to you." I didn't tell her the exact number. Some things don't need translating into figures to be understood. I told her enough, that my father had built something separate, something meant only for me, quietly and over many years because he knew, even if he never said it, that something had been out of balance. Diane cried, not performatively, not for my benefit, but the private kind of crying people do when a version of themselves they've protected for years finally cracks open. "Marlene doesn't know how much you carried," she said. "None of us watched closely enough to see it." I told her that wasn't an accusation I needed her to answer for. I hadn't come to extract an apology. I had come because truth, once it exists, has a way of insisting on being spoken, gently in its own time, to the people who need to hear it most, not to punish them, but to release everyone from the version of a story that had quietly been strangling all of us. Before I left, Diane reached for my hand across the table, the same gesture she'd given Marlene at the reading of the will, except this time it wasn't a celebration. It was an apology that had waited 20 years to find its shape. Marlene came to my apartment on a Thursday evening, unannounced, her car still running in the driveway as if she hadn't decided whether she was staying. "My mother told me," she said, before I'd even fully opened the door, "about the account. About everything." I let her in. I made tea, because that's what my mother would have done, and some habits are inherited whether you ask for them or not. Marlene sat across from me, smaller somehow than the woman in the black dress from the reading.
"I didn't know," she said.
"I swear to you, Aurora, I never once asked for more than you. I just took what was given. I never thought about what wasn't." I believed her. That's the part that surprised me most. How easily I believed her, once the pressure of secrecy was gone, and there was nothing left to defend. "I'm not here for revenge," I told her, and meant it fully for the first time since reading. "I don't want the house. I don't want the lake property. I never did. I wanted to know that what I gave this family, all those years of being quiet, being easy, being the one who never made things harder, was seen. That's all." Marlene was quiet for a long moment, turning her mug the same way her mother had. "You were always the stronger one," she said finally. "I think somewhere, without saying it, we all counted on that. We built our comfort on the fact that you'd never ask for anything back." It wasn't an excuse. I don't think she meant it as one. It was simply the truth finally being spoken instead of assumed, and there was a strange dignity in that. Two women, raised as sisters in all but blood, finally speaking to each other as equals instead of through the distorted mirror of who their family had decided each of them should be. We didn't resolve everything that night. Some wounds don't close in a single evening of tea and honesty. But something had shifted. The silence that had governed us for 20 years had finally been asked to leave the room. I didn't take Marlene to court. I never considered it, not even in the private, unkind corners of my imagination where people sometimes rehearse the confrontations they'll never actually stage. Instead, I used part of what my father left me to do something he never got the chance to see. I opened a small workshop space downtown, half hardware store and half community classroom, teaching basic home repair to women who'd never been taught, the kind of skill my father had given me without ceremony, the way he taught me to change a tire before I could drive. I named it Larkspur, after the street I grew up on, the crooked mailbox included in spirit, if not in fact. Diane came to the opening. So did Marlene, holding a bouquet of flowers that trembled slightly in her hands, as though she wasn't sure whether she'd be welcome. I hugged her at the door, and something in her shoulders finally let go, like a held breath released after years of holding it, without noticing. I didn't do this to prove anything to anyone. I want to be honest about that too. I did it because my father spent 15 quiet years correcting a silence with patience instead of confrontation, and I understood, standing in that workshop under lights I'd chosen myself, that this was the inheritance that actually mattered, not the money, but the method. The idea that you could answer an old unfairness not with fire, but with something built carefully enough to outlast the hurt that inspired it. I visited my parents' graves that winter, on the anniversary of my mother's passing, the maple tree above them bare and patient the way it always was that time of year. I told them about the workshop. I told them about Diane's tears at her kitchen table, and Marlene's trembling flowers, and the slow, unglamorous work of turning 20 years of quiet imbalance into something almost like peace. I didn't tell them I forgave them because I'm not certain forgiveness is a single sentence you get to say once and be done with. It's smaller than that and slower, a practice, repeated in small moments, the way my father repeated his quiet deposits year after year without ever needing anyone to see them. What I did tell them was thank you, not for the money, for trusting me, even silently, even imperfectly, even far too late, to become someone who could hold an unfairness in her hands and choose, deliberately, not to let it turn her into the very thing that had once been done to her. The wind moved through the bare branches above me, and for a moment I let myself believe it was an answer, Though I know now that peace doesn't usually arrive as a sign. It arrives as a decision made quietly and kept. I walked back to my car under a sky the color of unfinished paper, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like the daughter who was given nothing. I felt like the daughter who had finally been understood.